My name is Ellen. I moved here from New York about 25 years ago. I'm 60 now, but when I was 39, I was working at Genentech. I was president of my condo board, and I was very active in several LGBT organizations. With all that stress from those things triggered my illness, at first panic attacks. My father had bipolar disorder, and I never thought I would get it, but then that happened. And panic attacks are always horrible, but I was getting them at work. And, I felt I was going to pass out, that I was nauseous, and, and I was sitting in my little gray cube, and they're always horrible panic attacks, but it was so much more worse there. I was really afraid someone would come in or talk to me. As the panic attacks resolved, I then started to develop symptoms of major depression. I had trouble eating, I slept a long time, and I couldn't concentrate. I had a lot of trouble talking to people in general. And I finally realized that I needed to see a therapist, so I went into traditional therapy. But I kept on getting worse. I mean, it helped a bit, but I kept on getting worse. And as I started to feel more and more suicidal, I realized that I really needed to see a psychiatrist, that I had to admit that my illness was bad enough that in addition to therapy, I needed to be on meds. So I found a psychiatrist, and at that time, it didn't take that long for me to feel better. I just was on a couple of meds, tried a few different meds, tried to balance out side effects. And when that depression resolved, I felt fine for like 8 months. But then as I was driving to work, I would start feeling like I should drive off the road and kill myself. So at that time, I realized that I really needed to go back on medication. I knew that after one episode of major depression, you have about a 50-50 chance of having another one. So I was trying to see which part of that 50 I was in. But when I again got depressed, I also knew that after 2 episodes of major depression, you have about a 97% chance of having another one. So at that time, I realized that I needed to stay on meds for the foreseeable future. And again, it was a balancing act. This time, unfortunately, the meds that had worked the first time didn't work the second. It took me much longer to find a combination of meds that did work, and in general they were much stronger and unfortunately also had more side effects. I really tried to hide my illness at that point. From the depression I had lost 30 pounds, so when I went back east, my mother commented on how well I looked because I was thinner. And she had no idea, what was going on with me. Since I was able to hide how I was feeling, I didn't talk much and I slept more, but people didn't guess what I was going through, and it made it so much worse. I got no support. Today, I'm much more likely to talk about my depression. I find that people, not everybody, but just people who are very empathetic and give me a lot of support. In part, my family also helped me with, gave me some money because I couldn't work at that point. So as that episode of major depression resolved, I started to do a lot of volunteer work, and that's always been very important to me in general throughout my life. So, for example, I started teaching an adult how to read, and it doesn't sound like that. It doesn't mean that this guy couldn't just read a newspaper. He couldn't read a letter from his landlord or any other important information. And so I've been teaching him for about 3 years, and it's been very gratifying. He's 60, he was homeless for 13 years, he was using, and now we're both very proud of him, of the progress he's made. Another kind of volunteer work I do, which is extremely important to me, is I work to help reduce the stigma of mental illness. I've done this in several ways. I'm talking to you, that's helping. I wrote an article in the national newsletter of NAMI. NAMI stands for the National Association on Mental Illness. And it was really good, it was really neat. One day I was Googling myself and I saw like these Chinese letters, a few Chinese characters, and then it said, hence, more Chinese characters, NAMI. And what had happened is the National Institute of China had republished my article. It felt so good. Also, in general, I speak up, I speak to people through different organizations, which has been extremely gratifying. At this point, I say that I'm in recovery. When I first heard the word recovery, I didn't apply it to me. I wasn't working, I had to be on disability a lot of the time. But then, as I came to Mental Health Association and other organizations, I started to understand that recovery was how I defined it. And for me, it's kind of very general. I define recovery as leading a more full life. Again, my fighting stigma is a big part. Also, other things to balance out my life. For example, when I was working, I was a computer programmer, I had gone to engineering school, and now I was doing things like taking art classes, which was amazingly, I couldn't quite believe how much I enjoyed it. And it really developed another side to me. I know that some people believe that only homeless people who are showing symptoms, that they're the only people who have a mental illness. And that is so not true. I'm sitting here, I'm not homeless, I don't display symptoms, and a lot of us, almost all of us, for long periods of time don't display symptoms. So what this means is that there are so many more people with a mental illness that you would ever guess. And again, that's one reason I'm doing this recording, to show you that there are so many more people than you would ever think. Thank you. My treatment, traditional therapy and medication has been extremely helpful. When I first got depressed, I tried to deal with it on my own and couldn't, so I first went into therapy. And it helped for a while, but I started to get more and more depressed. I started to have thoughts of suicide. And I finally had to admit that I really also needed to be on medication. I was able to find a psychiatrist who really allowed me to give a lot of input. I've always done a lot of research into my illness, into treatments, and with that first episode of major depression, medication was extremely useful. I felt well. Once I started feeling well, I tapered off the meds, and at that point I was fine for 8 months, but then realized I really needed to restart meds. I find that one very useful thing of therapy is it helps me to identify how my depression and anxiety are affecting how I feel and what I say. Also, when I start feeling a lot more stable from therapy and medication, I find that I can reach out for different types of therapy. Probably one very useful treatment was meditation. It really helps with anxiety to keep me. To maintain my recovery, I do several things. I meditate. I've started exercising. It was really amazing. I went to the gym for the first time when I was 56, and I discovered I really like it. I also find it good to try to incorporate exercise. I really like taking long walks with friends. Sorry. Some other things, at least things I try to do, are to keep a more regular sleep schedule, to eat healthier, and to set boundaries. And I realize, I'm kind to myself. I realize that all those habits can take a while to break or to get over. A big part of my recovery and my self-care has been to go to a support group. Sometimes it's very difficult for me to get up and actually get there, but once I'm there, I find it's great. It's a peer-run group. It's very healing, and you know, people help me, I help them. It's very important to me. What's also good is that I get involved in that group. I help run it in some ways. For example, I run the monthly education night, and I think it's very important, since it's peer-led, that feels really good. I'm doing a lot of good work.
Yeah.
So, the role of choice, that's a really basic question for me. In general, I feel that I'm assertive and not passive. One example that comes to mind is I do a lot of research about my illness, about treatments. I love the internet. I'm trained as a librarian as well as a programmer, so I do a lot of in-depth research. I found a psychiatrist who totally respects that about me. Every now and then I print out a paper and give it to him, and he reads it and is very grateful. I make a choice to fight stigma, not to accept just to accept it. I make a choice to identify where stigma exists. I know I have, in addition to outside stigma, I know I have a lot of self-stigma. I make sure, I try very hard to identify when that self-stigma comes up. It's not always obvious to me. I often hear, and I used to say things like, I am bipolar. What I've realized is that I am not bipolar, that I have bipolar disorder. People never say I am heart attack. I'm much more than just my illness. What I say to someone who's gone through something similar is that, first of all, I say that you're not alone. Then I talk to the person, I get a sense of things that they have gone through. So I know that we've had different experiences, so I find out some things that we have gone through, and I tell them that I have made it. I'm very careful. One thing I learned in my support group is I don't give advice to someone. So what I say is, when I had that symptoms, this is what I did. I may open up, I may list some different types of therapy just for the person to have some guidance. Also, I know that there are things that we don't have in common, and I respect that, and I let the person know that I feel bad for about that they went through. I also talk about recovery and explain what it means. It's very empowering to feel like you're in recovery. A big reason why I'm here today is I want to let you know that anybody can have a mental illness. I know that sometimes people say, instead of mental illness, they say people with a mental health challenge. And I don't like that. I feel that, at least in English, the word depression covers everything from, oh, it's raining, I'm so depressed, to I'm too depressed to get out of bed or eat. So I am very clear that I have a mental illness, I have bipolar disorder, And it's very important for me to be up here and tell you that, and make sure that there's no way in hell that you ever use the word crazy. Yeah, and I didn't say this, but the first time I had a panic attack, I felt like I was having a heart attack.
Yeah.
So I actually went to the ER. The doctors agreed with me. They immediately took me in, but I started feeling much better halfway through the EKG. As my panic attacks resolved, my depression manifested itself as I couldn't eat. I lost 30 pounds. And again, I couldn't communicate. I was very shut down.